Okay, this is background of the Civil War Part 6 lecture. We're going to be looking at a phenomenal work of fiction called Uncle Tom's Cabin and the impact that that had. The election of 1856 and something known as Bleeding Kansas. The Supreme Court decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. All of these things are events that further alienated North from South and South from North as the 1850s went by. Okay. A novel came out in about 1852. It was entitled, actually, the original title was The Man Who Was a Thing. And that was followed up by another title of the same work. It's called A Laugh Among the Lowly. What they settled on was Uncle Tom's Cabin, originally published in serial form, that is, a chapter at a time, in newspapers. Okay, the original printing run was 5,000 copies. Within 6 months, it had sold 300,000 and went on to be the number one bestseller of the entire 19th century, only the Bible outselling it. Okay, the author was a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the wife of a seminary professor. She was the daughter of a very prominent Calvinistic abolitionist preacher named Lyman Beecher. It's always been a bit unfortunate that preacher and Beecher rhymed. Well, she was the sixth of 11 children. She had several brothers who were also very prominent abolitionist preachers, including probably most famous Henry Ward Beecher. Anyway, she just wished there was something that she could do. She was from Connecticut, I believe. She had lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. That's on the Ohio River, which just across the river is Kentucky. Kentucky is a slave state. She saw with her own eyes and sympathized with fugitive slaves and the slave catchers who were hunting them and all of that. So she had some familiarity with this. So she wrote a fiction novel entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it had very strongly drawn characters. Uncle Tom, and the term Uncle Tom has come to mean, opposite to what it meant in her novel, a kind of sellout among the black community, when in fact the character is very different from that. Little Eva, the cruel slave master Simon Legree, whom she was careful to make a northerner who'd gone south. Anyway, this thing set off a storm. It sold like wildfire. It was eventually translated into 22 languages. International bestseller, very popular in Britain and other countries. And what it did was break or seriously damage the myth people had clung to that everybody was happy in the South and the slaves were well treated and they were happy and they were treated better than the northern factory workers and all of that. So this was very powerful and emotional work. 19th century people were pushovers for emotional stuff like this. So it gives an idea that's closer to the truth than the myth was of how black people lived and how they were treated. Critics have pointed out that Mrs. Stowe subscribed to a number of racial stereotypes now known to have been very false. Nonetheless, it moved the ball down the field and greatly strengthened the abolition movement in the North. Southerners objected to it. Southern postmasters would pull it out of the mail and burn it. She was actually trying to get Southerners to be more empathetic. That didn't work. Anyway, this is a huge thing. All right. We left off last time with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is said to have destroyed two compromises. It repealed the Missouri Compromise from 1820, and it wrecked the Compromise of 1850 because it made the Southerners and their leaders look duplicitous, that they could not be trusted. They could not be trusted to keep the terms of a compromise. So compromise, which is all that held the Union together for over 30 years, compromise, well, there won't be any more compromises after that. Okay. Now, Southerners thought that they had been given Kansas as a potential slave state because they divided much of the previously unorganized territory into Kansas and Nebraska, which at the time went all the way to Canada. I won't get into the map peculiarities, but they were both open to slavery under popular sovereignty. So Southerners smugly thought they had Kansas in the bag, woke up too late to realize that Kansas is being settled by the westward movement. And most of the people moving to Kansas were just regular people. They weren't Southerners with slaves. They were what has been called free soilers. Okay, these were small farmers who probably didn't have anything like a moral objection to slavery. They just didn't want to have to compete with slave owners, because wherever that happened, they just get stomped in the dust. You simply could not compete with the big slave owners, so they favored keeping slavery out. According to some, they were also, and they may have been racists who didn't want to be around black people, and a good way to keep black people out was to keep slavery out. The 1860 census found only 7 African Americans in the entirety of Kansas. Well, anyway, the pro-slavery interests went into a kind of a 2-minute drill, full court press, to get Kansas organized as a slave state. So the first thing you do there is to elect a territorial legislature. Forgot about that. What? Sorry, just a little entertainment. It's amazing how much better you can breathe with those things on. Getting it off is something of an adventure. You noticed it before I did. Where was I? Held a territorial, elect a territorial legislature. All right. So since the part of Kansas that was being settled was pretty much up and down the Missouri border, it wasn't very far. The entirety of Kansas is not populated yet by the Western movement. You had pro-slavery Missourians. Missouri was a slave state, heading in large numbers over into Kansas and voting early and often. If their right to vote were challenged, they'd pull back their jacket to reveal a big old hog-leg Colt revolver and say, Your Honor, this here's my right to vote. Take one, take several. So they elected a pro-slavery territorial legislature in a territory with relatively few pro-slavery people in it. All right, once they're seated, things begin to roll. For one thing, the anti-slavery people they elected another territorial legislature. So you have 2 competing legislatures, one pro-slavery, one anti. The pro-slavery ones cooked up a proposed state constitution. That's your next step. You propose a state constitution and put it before the voters in a referendum. If it passes, it goes to Congress as an application for statehood. Well, the slavery backers knew they're not going to get. See, normally it's just they're voting to accept it or not. They're not voting between 2 alternatives. But if it's got slavery in it, it's going to go down in flames. So what the legislature did, the pro-slavery legislature, what they did was to give the people a choice of 2 different versions of the proposed state constitution. You got to have something that looks like an election. Problem was, slavery was legal in both of them. There was not a way to vote against it except just boycott the election. That's what they did, and that's one version of the other passed and was sent to Congress as an application for statehood. Well, this is all under popular sovereignty, so members of Congress are perplexed. What do we do about this? This is not the way it's supposed to work. So it's getting tight in a hurry. By 1856, the settlers in Kansas started shooting at each other. They started shooting at each other. So you get this little low-grade civil war that starts up and sort of simmers on in the background until merging with the main event that started 5 years later. The most spectacular incident was when a very, what word shall I use? It doesn't sound uncomplimentary. He was an extreme abolitionist named John Brown. He had several adult sons who were as abolitionists as he was, and they raided like a homestead settled by some Southerners who didn't own any slaves, but they were pro-slavery, pulled the men out of the bed and hacked them to death with broadswords in front of their families, like seven of them. at a place called Potawatomi. And got away with it for the time being. So this became Bleeding Kansas. It's in the background when, there's one thing I wanted to put in. I'm going to step back just a second. There were also outright abolitionists moving to Kansas. There was an organization up in Massachusetts calling itself the New England Immigrant Aid Company. And they were sending Northeasterners to live in Kansas and keep it from becoming a slave state. And they carried with them a little parting gift they were given when they left Massachusetts, referred to as Beecher's Bibles. Beecher's Bibles were not big black books. Beecher's Bibles, that was a euphemism for a Sharps breech-loading rifle, which could be used to convert the ungodly, or give them an up-close and personal introduction to the Almighty in a short time. This got violence written all over it. Okay, 1856 presidential election. We have a brand new major party, which is not a national party. Okay, that's another effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The beginning of the Republican Party, which still exists. It came out of nowhere in about a 3 months' time. It included a lot of anti-slavery Democrats, free soilers, former Whigs. The Whig Party's gone by then. This is when Abraham Lincoln became a Whig. And members of a short-lived anti-immigration party called the popularly known as the Know Nothing Party. The video I had got that wrong. Its members were instructed to answer if somebody asked them about the party, they're supposed to say, "I know nothing." The Democrats were hanging together by a thread. Northern and Southern Democrats were already deeply alienated. How are they going to find a candidate that they can all vote for? They selected an elderly man named James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. What made Buchanan electable was that he'd been out of the country for several years serving as a diplomat. Hence, he has no statements on the record about Bleeding Kansas or the Kansas-Nebraska Act or popular sovereignty or any of that stuff. So they both vote for him. So James Buchanan, who deserves to be rated among the very poorest of all American, poorest in the sense of really not being qualified, being out of his depth in over his head. James Buchanan won, defeating the first ever Republican nominee, John C. Fremont, also known as the Pathfinder, who is credited with securing California at the end of the Mexican-American War. Okay. It's probably a good thing Fremont didn't win, because the minute a Republican wins, the Union's going to break up. That was already fairly obvious. And John C. Fremont, for all his sterling qualities, he's not Abe Lincoln. Okay. James Buchanan remains the only Pennsylvanian ever to be elected president. Okay. Now, 2 days after he was sworn in March 1857, he wasn't something he did. The Supreme Court announced its ruling in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Now, Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. He was not a field hand or anything. He was like a valet, as the English pronounce it. Thank you. Body servant for a man who was a doctor in the U.S. Army. And this doctor, his name was not Sanford, I don't think. The doctor took Dred Scott with him wherever he went, including postings in the free state of Illinois and the free then territory of, I think, Minnesota. In the fullness of time, the doctor died. His widow inherited Dred Scott and his wife, Dred Scott's wife. And they sued in the Missouri state courts for their freedom based on the fact that they had been illegally held as a slave in a free state and a free territory. Now, up until then, it may seem surprising, that would have been routine open and shut. The state courts in a slave state would routinely grant them their freedom. And I'm going to have to take this up in the next video.